This is the My Dark Path podcast. "13-year-old Yokota Megumi, a typical junior high school student, was walking home from badminton practice after school with two friends on the afternoon of November 15, 1977, in Nagata. Nagata is a seaside town on the northern coast of Honshu, the largest Japanese island. She had grown up in a city by the sea and was simply a typical middle school student, liked by her friends and respectful of her parents. She said goodbye to her friends as they parted company at 6:00 p.m. when she was 3 blocks from Yori Junior High School and less than 800 feet from her front door. And that was the last any Japanese person saw of Yokota. By 7 p.m. that evening, her rather strict mother began to panic when Megumi, who was never late, was overdue. And when her father, Yokota Shigeru, got home from his job at the bank, he called the police. The parents and the officers spent much of the night searching the neighborhood and the nearby beach and the schoolyard, but no sign of Megumi was found. A special kidnapping unit of the police arrived at the Yokota house the next day to wait for a ransom call, but none came. Helicopters and boats went up and down the shore looking for the girl or her body. Divers swam the Nagata harbor seeing if she had drowned somehow. And weeks passed and there was no sign of the teenager. No note, no nothing. And in 1983, the family, unable to stay in the home of their tragedy, moved to Tokyo, but they left a note in plastic on the gate with their new address in case Megumi ever came back. But she never did. She couldn't. You see, on that afternoon in November of 1977, Megumi had been taken by 2 agents of North Korea who kidnapped her, brought her to North Korea to convince her that North Korea was the best nation on earth and have her train North Korean spies to speak and act Japanese so that they could infiltrate Japanese society. Megumi was one of at least 17 victims of the North Korean abduction project, the very dark path we will walk down today. Hi, I'm MF Thomas, and this is the My Dark Path podcast. Every episode explores the fringes of history, science, and the paranormal. So if you geek out over these subjects, you're among friends here at My Dark Path. And we hope you'll check us out on Instagram, X, and sign up for our newsletter at mydarkpath.com. Or simply send me an email to explore@mydarkpath. We also want to thank our Patreon supporters. Check out our Patreon, where subscribers will have access to exclusive full episodes, starting with our special mini-series, a My Dark Path tour of history, science, and paranormal in Cold War Moscow that we're calling Secrets of the Soviets. If you're interested, just head over to our website and consider becoming one of our many Patreon supporters. I'm so grateful for all of their support. Finally, thanks for listening and choosing to walk the dark paths of the world with me. Let's get started by heading to the Korean Peninsula at the turn of the century and briefly look at the history of the Korean people and why 2 separate nations emerged from the Second World War, one of which found it profitable to abduct not only the citizens of its southern counterpart, but also Japanese, Chinese, and Europeans as well. Part 1. The relationship between Japan and Korea could be described as it's complicated. Several times in its history, the Korean Peninsula was invaded and occupied by foreign powers. The Mongol Empire in the 13th century, the Japanese invasion at the end of the 16th century, and the Manchus in the 17th. Korea remained a tributary state of China until 1895, when the Japanese won the Sino-Japanese War and Korea was declared independent, a state that lasted only 10 years until the Russo-Japanese War broke out in 1904 and Korea became a Japanese protectorate in 1905. By 1907, Japan had full administration of the Korean Peninsula, and in 1910 it formally annexed Korea, making it a Japanese colony. The Japanese imposed martial law, insisted that the official language would now be Japanese, and that all education and government functions could only be carried out in Japanese. The Koreans resisted, and the Japanese rule grew sterner and more oppressive. And as Japan began to advance what it called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, but what was really an anti-Western coalition of nations conquered by Japan to enforce Japanese hegemony, Korea was used as a staging area for attacks throughout East Asia and the South Pacific. And no doubt you've heard of the term comfort women, Korean women drafted into sexual slavery for the Japanese army. And by 1945, Japan was defeated and the Korean peninsula was now occupied by the United States in the south and the Soviet Union in the north. Now, this split made for a tension within what was now two separate nations. The Soviet Red Army had occupied Korea from the border down to the 38th parallel in August of 1945, and the American Army began to work its way north from the south coast. Each side sought out like-minded Koreans to help them set up their style of government, matching what was occurring in Germany in Europe at the time. The difference was Germany was a defeated enemy occupied by the victors. Korea was a nation colonized and enslaved by Japan and was now occupied by two other foreign powers. Supposedly, the occupying powers were only present to help Korea achieve independence and get back on its feet after decades of Japanese occupation. However, two incompatible governments were set up in the South and the North, and a conservative coalition of business owners, wealthy landowners, Christian missionaries, Korean independence movement leaders, and ethnic Koreans returned to the peninsula after the war, convinced the Americans to give the independence at the earliest possible date, free from American and Soviet domination. The Americans agreed, but the Soviets believed the Americans had broken their agreement and were trying to separate the South from the North, believing all of Korea would be communist when the opportunity arose. And this is the key reason why North Korea believes South Korea is an illegitimate nation. Soviet propaganda that the Americans stole the southern half of the peninsula. The levels of animosity and desire for the entire nation, not just half of it, rose in the north until finally reunification became impossible and the northern part of Korea was placed in the hands of Kim Il-sung, handpicked by the Soviets to lead the communist nation. Kim had been a member of the Red Army and was a native of Pyongyang, so he seemed to be an excellent choice to reinforce Soviet leadership on the Korean peninsula. And in the south, the Americans installed Syngman Rhee, an American-educated independence leader, as the new president of South Korea. In 1948, the Americans pulled out and the Republic of Korea was declared, followed by Kim Il-sung declaring the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north. Kim believed the Americans had imposed democracy on the South, and if given a choice, the Korean people would prefer to be united under the single banner of the Communist North. Thus, in 1950, announcing that he had no other choice, Kim ordered the invasion of the Republic of Korea in the South in order to liberate it. After receiving assurances from the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union that they would have his back and support his war efforts, on June 25th, Kim's troops poured over the border, resulting in a 3-year war with 2 million Koreans dead on both sides. The United Nations, taking advantage of the walkout by the Soviet ambassador while a meeting was still in session and thus unable to veto, voted to send troops to support the South. The United States and 15 other nations joined the combat and pushed the Northern Army back to the 38th parallel. On June 27th of 1953, a truce ended the conflict, although there was still not a peace treaty and technically the two Koreas remain at war. Under the terms of the armistice, a 4-kilometer strip between the two nations was established, known as the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone. A truce village was established in the DMZ where exchanges can take place. The Cold War meant a change in dynamics in East Asia, with North Korea on the side of the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, and South Korea on the side of the United States and its allies. The global order shifted. After the American occupation of Japan ended in 1952, a considerable effort was made by the United States to keep Japan on the side of the Western Bloc. South Korea still had memories of Japanese atrocities. They protested when, for example, each year the Japanese Prime Minister would visit the Yasukuni War Shrine and lay a wreath at the memorial, thus honoring Japanese soldiers who'd been in Korea. But now, Japan and the Republic of Korea were now on the same team, opposing communism and supporting capitalism. And as such, South Korea regarded Japan as less of an enemy as it had been in the past. No such transition occurred in North Korea. Japan was and remained a mortal enemy of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and North Korea wanted Japan to pay for what it had done, and wanted Japanese people to know both how they had made Korea suffer and how much better life was now under Kim Il-sung and communism. Now, South Korea was also an enemy to the North, thought of as an illegitimate state illegally made by the United States. North Korea began having difficulties in the decade after the Korean War as China and the Soviet Union split over differences in their approaches to both communism and global relationships. Kim pronounced his philosophy of Juche-shang, or Juche for short, which is roughly translated as self-reliance. Since not even the Soviets or the Chinese could be relied upon, North Korea would build itself into the greatest nation on the planet and demonstrate to all its enemies its superiority. In order to do that, however, they needed technical expertise and help spying. The best way to get both was to look to nearby enemy states of South Korea and Japan and abduct people, first showing them the superiority of North Korea, and then learning from their abductees what was needed to help spies or advance their own technology. So beginning in the 1970s, many Japanese and South Korean citizens began disappearing from their own nations under strange circumstances, walking home from school, having a romantic stroll on the beach at night, sailing or fishing, riding one's bike, and every other activity that would be considered normal could end with a person or couple missing. It was later learned that these individuals were taken by North Korean agents and either placed on a boat that would take them out into the Sea of Japan, where there was a larger North Korean boat waiting, or they would be drugged and put on an airplane that would be diverted to North Korea. North Korea even went so far as to hijack South Korean commercial flights in order to get people. Of course, the fact that North Korea had to kidnap people in order to prove their supposed superiority tells you everything you need to know. Communism is a self-destructive system that demands complete obedience or death. Part 2. Given North Korea's approach to politics and international relations, you wouldn't be surprised that it also has an odd way of categorizing movies. The 4 categories of North Korean films are the following. First, feature-length artistic films of any genre. Second, documentaries. Third, scientific films, which are a category separate from documentaries. And then lastly, fourth, films for children. The feature-length artistic films can be of any type: romance, science fiction, drama, war. There's no distinction between the genre and subject matter. And the documentaries are unlike documentaries of other cultures. Their style is similar to American newsreels of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. They tend not to have narrative, but simply record events. And the events they record tend to be those that document the perfection of North Korean leadership and the party. So they tend to show party meetings, the leaders' on-the-spot guidance, which is, of course, always brilliant and insightful and never an error, heroic individuals and collectives, and people showing devotion to the Kim family. Scientific films, on the other hand, are closer to the Discovery Channel and National Geographic, teaching about the natural world or the proper scientific way to do things, such as plant crops or tend to animals. Children's films include animation, instructional or educational videos, live children's shows, and dramas aimed to indoctrinate young North Koreans. North Koreans love the cinema. But like everything else in North Korea, every aspect of filmmaking and movie watching is political. All films must support Juche and glorify the nation and the regime. Villains must be capitalists or those who are politically suspect and are often in the pay of the Americans. The heroes are ordinary North Koreans who, because of their spirit and their leaders' triumph over all adversity. These precepts do not necessarily make for a truly great national cinema, and of course this isn't just a North Korean concept. Just look at the disastrous U.S. film and TV industry that has displaced story and character building with a monolithic, not to mention tedious and boring, political message. Now, once he was established as his father's second-in-command and the heir to rule North Korea, Kim Jong-il turned his sights to the cinema. He also loved film. Kim's vast personal film library reportedly consisted over 15,000 films from around the world. At a time before Blu-ray, DVD, or even VHS, he had 15mm prints of 15,000 films. In 1973, he published his magnum opus, which I won't read in Korean, but is translated as, quote, On the Art of the Cinema. Now, you can read it. It has been translated into English and is available on the internet, and I put the link in the show notes, but be warned, it's almost 500 pages long and rather dense and obscure. Kim advances his theories about what makes for good cinema and how films should work. His two most prominent theories are humanics and seed theory. The former asks what makes a good and worthy life and emphasizes how right-thinking individuals can transform society through good art and thus, in turn, transform the world. Now, seed theory argues that all artistic creation is directed through a single ideological foundation, the seed in the title, and that everything in the film, from story to costume to props to performance, are both generated by and received through this seed. The idea proved to be indispensable for North Korean film theory and North Korean film industry practice, and anyone wishing to make films in North Korea had to both read the book and embrace seed theory. And as an aside, I wonder if Disney is also making Kim Jong-il's book required reading and is a part of their seemingly pathological commitment to making tedious political movies that, unsurprisingly, also lose money. But the book also cemented Kim Jong-il as the leader of North Korean culture. His father, Kim Il-sung, placed him in charge of North Korean culture, and Kim the Younger wanted to build up North Korea's film industry. He was deeply disappointed that North Korean films were not more appreciated or celebrated outside the country, and allegedly and privately admitted that their cinema was just not very good, although it was ideologically perfect. Again, it sounds like Disney. And he was very jealous of South Korean cinema and wanted North Korean cinema to rival it. So, what did he do? He kidnapped people. In 1979, Choi Young-hee was a major star of Korean cinema, and her husband, Shin Jong-gun, was a celebrated director. They were a celebrity couple recognized throughout South Korea, but Shin's affair with an actress and the couple's financial problems led to divorce. And at the time, Choi received an invitation to travel to Hong Kong to meet with producers of a new film. It seemed, if the promised production worked out, at least some of their financial problems could be solved. The invitation, though, was a part of a plot by North Korean agents. When she arrived, she was escorted to a speedboat down by the docks in Hong Kong, where she was kidnapped and brought to North Korea. Upon arrival, she was greeted by no less than Kim Jong-il himself, who shook her hand and said, "Thanks for coming," as photographers snapped pictures of the two of them together. Kim had ordered her brought to North Korea by any means necessary, but once she arrived, she was treated as a celebrity who had come voluntarily. After Choi disappeared from Hong Kong without a trace, Shin began to look for her. And at the same time, he was traveling around Asia looking for a producer who might support his next film, as the South Korean government had suspended his license to make films in South Korea. He was invited to Hong Kong, where, just like Choi, he was kidnapped by North Korean agents just 6 months after his estranged wife was. Now, because he kept trying to escape, Shin spent 3 years in a North Korean prison and only then was reunited with Choi. Again, Kim Jong-il was present at the party in which the two were reunited. Initially, they were given access to Kim's film library and instructed to watch and critique 4 films every day. Kim wanted them to understand his perspective on movie making. Then they were told that they were to make great films together like they had in South Korea, but this time in the service of the North Korean people. And from 1983 until their eventual escape in 1989, they made 17 films for Kim Jong-il, feature-length films in a variety of genres. The films they made during that 7-year period were varied. An Emissary of No Return was based on a stage play by Kim Il-sung about a Korean diplomat in the early 20th century who killed himself to draw attention to Japanese atrocities in Korea. And it was actually filmed its Western scenes in Czechoslovakia. Love, Love, My Love was a film musical adaptation of a Korean folktale. The tale of Shim Chung was based on a famous classical Korean story of a young girl who volunteers to be thrown in the sea as a sacrifice to help her family and ends up marrying the Dragon King of the sea. But most interestingly, in 1985, the same year that the United States re-edited the Japanese film Gojira from the previous year and released it as Godzilla 1985, Shin directed North Koreans' contribution to the giant monster genre. Pulgasari is a fascinating film combining the men in rubber suits giant monster movie vibe with Juche philosophy and Korean history as perceived by Kim. The film is set in feudal Korea when an evil king fears a peasant uprising, so he confiscates all metal tools and arrests a blacksmith who defended the people's right to iron tools. The blacksmith manufactures a dragon doll, and when his daughter accidentally bleeds on it, the doll becomes a giant metallic monster that consumes metal. As the king's troops attack the peasants, they resist, and Pulgasari, for that is what the monster is called, works with the peasants to fight the king and his forces. And after much heroic sacrifice, the people defeat the king, but Pulgasari keeps eating all the metal, and so the blacksmith's daughter must sacrifice herself to destroy Pulgasari, as he has become the new oppressor. The people are then free to found a collective in which the nation is ruled justly for and by the people. In order to achieve the monster effects in the film, a Japanese special effects team from Toho, the studio that actually makes the Godzilla films, was hired, being told they were making a film in China, only to find themselves in North Korea. But unlike Shin and Choi, they were allowed to return to Japan when their work was completed. And while in North Korea, they were treated as honored and respected guests, at least as much as temporary hostages might be. But it is a curious film, and North Korea released it to the international market, Kim believing it would attract as much interest, love, and support as Godzilla, but no other nation was interested in showing the film. It was finally screened in Japan in 1998, and it was also distributed in South Korea, but it has never found a home in the larger global market, the propaganda aspect rendering the film rather ridiculous. And in a future episode in Season 4 of My Dark Path, we will be looking at this film in much more detail as a part of a larger exploration of North Korean science fiction. With each film, Shin and Choi were sent to various film festivals in communist nations and were told exactly what to say in interviews, specifically that they had voluntarily immigrated to North Korea as they could no longer stand working in the corrupt and decadent South, and that North Korea was in fact a glorious workers' paradise. So long as their handlers were with them, Shin and Choi repeated this lie. But while in Vienna in March of 1989 to discuss making a movie about Genghis Khan, they evaded their minders, got lost in traffic, and escaped to the U.S. Embassy, where they asked for asylum. Shin then remained in the United States, and Choi returned to South Korea. And to this day, North Korea claims they were not abducted but voluntarily defected to North Korea. One of the problems with that claim is that so many other South Koreans, Japanese, and others who were far less famous and connected than Shin and Choi had also been kidnapped. Part 3. Shin and Choi were actually the exception, being famous people kidnapped by the North Korean government at Kim's specific request. The vast majority of North Korean abductions were random, targeting people who had no fame or political significance. Indeed, they were often targets of convenience. People were taken because they were where the North Korean abductors were looking for someone to take. North Korean spies disguised their boats to look like Japanese fishing vessels and would drift off the coast of Japan, sending individual North Koreans to shore to grab anyone they could find. Very quickly, a specific process was established for the Japanese abductees. The North Koreans would arrive at dusk on a beach, grab a young Japanese couple, cover their heads with bags, and bring them out to the boat, separate and isolate them, and then deliver them to North Korea. The North Koreans discovered it took about a year and a half before the kidnapped individual could be broken down, had learned the Korean language, and would no longer try to escape. They would then be reunited with the person they had been kidnapped with. The North Koreans had learned that keeping the couple together made it easier for them to resist brainwashing, and keeping them completely isolated and never reunited also resulted in depression and suicide. By ultimately reuniting the couple after they had been individually brainwashed, the couple acted as hostages for each other. Every abducted person in North Korea was assigned a minder, a specific individual responsible for every aspect of their education, the Korean language, Juche philosophy, and every aspect of their lives in North Korea, from where they lived to with whom they could speak. An escaped or resistant guest would mean punishment for the minder, so they worked very hard to ensure compliance on the part of their abducted charge. After they had been individually brainwashed and then reunited, the couple would be married, and then they would be assigned to live in something called an invitation-only zone. This was a neighborhood that, by its name, would seem to be elite and exclusive, but in reality, it was a neighborhood prison in which politically risky individuals could be kept separate from the rest of the North Korean population. Invitation-only zones are heavily guarded, and one cannot leave them without one's minder. They exist in the suburbs of Pyongyang, which seems apt, near the political, cultural, and social heart of North Korea. But on the border that separates the city from the countryside, neither here nor there, a limbo state for permanent guests of the North Koreans who always claim to have chosen to defect. To claim otherwise would be to invite a trip to a prison camp in the northern mountains. The regime had an official narrative, and those who knew it was not true either kept that information to themselves or vanished. The very design of the invitation-only zone discouraged contact between neighbors other than at official functions. A central building served as a meeting place for the community for official announcements. Houses were spread out and set among artificially created forests and hills so that no one could easily approach a neighbor's house without being seen by the guards. While this setup was obviously an extended prison, the irony is that people who lived in invitation-only zones enjoyed better food and a better lifestyle than most North Koreans. The invitation-only zones also served as observation centers where North Koreans who were sent abroad as spies might study and scrutinize how Japanese or South Koreans living there behaved and interacted in private moments. In short, an invitation-only zone was not only a prison, but it was also a zoo. Yokota Megumi, who we talked about in the introduction, most likely lived for decades in an invitation-only zone, as did other kidnapped Japanese. For decades, the Japanese government was likely aware of the abductions, but publicly said nothing, and victims' families tried for years to bring attention to the issue. Ultimately, in the 21st century, the Japanese government confirmed that at least 17 Japanese nationals had been abducted, but it was likely that dozens, if not 100 more, had also been kidnapped. The month before Megumi had been snatched, another young woman, Masumoto Kiyota, was abducted while walking to a knitting class near her home. She was 29 years old. Restaurant worker Kanada Minoru, 28, departed Japan for Europe for a vacation in June of 1978, but never arrived. He was later reported in North Korea. Taguchi Yoko was a 22-year-old young woman when she was kidnapped. After the bombing of a Korean airliner by a North Korean spy, that spy was captured and revealed that Taguchi taught her the Japanese language and culture. It's believed that Taguchi was forcibly married to Hara Tadaoki, a 43-year-old abducted in June of 1980, and that the two of them were living together in an invitation-only zone. The North Korean government later claimed that he had died of a disease and that Taguchi was killed in an automobile accident, but offered no evidence of either claim, nor did it ever produce the bodies for their families. Japanese students were kidnapped from Europe, grabbed off beaches in Japan, and abducted while in transit. In short, the abductions were often in random places. And the randomness of the abductions was used as evidence by North Koreans that there were in fact no kidnappings. Why would the secret police of North Korea spend so much time and effort, not to mention risk, getting caught on foreign soil, only to kidnap nobodies, inconsequential individuals, teenagers, students, and young couples? It didn't make any sense, and no ransom was ever asked for. The kidnappings were never even acknowledged by North Korea. However, during the period of thawing in the early 21st century, when North Korea reached out to its enemies and neighbors, Japan and North Korea held a joint summit. On September 17, 2002, Japanese diplomats and the foreign minister traveled to Pyongyang for the meeting. Kim Jong-il himself confirmed that North Korea had indeed abducted a number of Japanese citizens and apologized for the practice. Yet, North Korea continued to hold those that they had abducted. Kim promised to hold those officials responsible for the kidnappings responsible and punish them appropriately, and attempt to facilitate meetings of families and their kidnapped loved ones in North Korea. It was not just movie stars and the Japanese that had been abducted, however. It is known that at least 486 South Koreans had been forcibly kidnapped to the north and never returned, at least as of 2005. And North Korea also abducted their own dissenters, kidnapped from South Korea and then the Soviet Union, China, and the West. And even before Shin and Choi, even before the Japanese, North Korea abducted targets of opportunity from South Korea. An old photo from 1974 was recently smuggled out of North Korea. It shows a group of young men in their late 20s and early 30s standing in front of the Myeongsan mountain. Every person in the photo was a missing South Korean. They had all been fishermen whose boats had drifted into North Korean territorial waters, whose boats had been seized and the men themselves taken to North Korea for indoctrination. Other South Koreans had been grabbed in various places by North Korean spies and brought to the north to live in invitation-only zones as North Korean citizens. Fishermen and students hardly seemed to have access to any valuable intelligence or unique skills not available in North Korea, but they could still be trained as spies or train North Korean intelligence operatives themselves. A number of abductees found themselves working for the North Korean government's propaganda division, broadcasting into South Korea and preparing disinformation campaigns to be used outside the country. For example, in December of 1969, a Korean Airlines jet was flying a domestic route from Gangneung Air Base to Seoul and was hijacked 10 minutes into the flight by a North Korean agent. As the plane turned north, 3 North Korean military jets accompanied it. The immediate presence of the jets seemed to suggest that this was a planned event and planned at the highest levels of North Korean government. The pilot of the passenger jet was forced to land in North Korea. There, the communist authorities claimed that the airplane crew had purposefully defected to protest the government of South Korea's policies toward the north. Eventually, 2 stewardesses from the flight became announcers of the North Korean propaganda broadcasts that targeted South Korean audiences, and they were still alive in North Korea as of 2001. All 4 crew and 7 out of the 46 passengers are still in North Korea. The other 39 passengers were released after 2 months of captivity. They reported that they had been subjected to lengthy indoctrination sessions during the 66 days of their internment. It's not known why the North Koreans released these passengers and kept the others. Again, the victims seemed to be taken at random. Wrong place and wrong time. And these abductions, however, were not meaningless in the eyes of the North Korean government. They served very real purposes. Japanese, South Koreans, and Westerners met a number of objectives for the government. First, the Japanese provided language and culture training to help the North Korean spies blend in. Second, the kidnapped South Koreans were part of the larger project to reunify Korea under Kim's rule. They could also help train North Korean spies to work in the South and perhaps even return to the South as spies themselves. Given the North's continued animosity toward Japan, the blatant and flagrant kidnapping of Japanese nationals on Japanese soils, with the Japanese government powerless to stop them, also humiliated Japan, which was a constant goal of the North Koreans. The dream was to transform these Japanese abductees into agents of the North Koreans. Kim-loving, Juche-spouting, revolutionary Japanese set to overthrow the Japanese government and free the Japanese people, or at least serve as agents of chaos. And lastly, the abductions represent the genuine belief or a cynical facade, depending on whom you ask, that they are rescuing people from a decadent world and educating them to live in a glorious workers' paradise. The minders seem to genuinely believe that their charges would embrace Juche and the North Korean identity and help spread the philosophy and ideology of Kim Il-sung throughout Asia and eventually Europe and the Americas. And by 2002, it seemed that Kim the Younger realized that this was not going to happen and instead chose to reveal the program. But even North Korean allies were not safe from the abduction project. North Korea had allegedly abducted 200 citizens of China. As with Japan, for most of the period this practice occurred, the Chinese government neither accused North Korea of abducting its citizens nor requested their return in order to keep the peace with this erratic communist hermit kingdom. And as for the fishermen in the photograph, in some cases the captured crews were eventually repatriated, but often Pyongyang alleged that at least a few crew members had, quote, chosen to stay in the socialist paradise and not go to the living hell of the capitalist South. Part 4. Yokota Megumi's story is a sad one, and part of it she doesn't even know herself. The 13-year-old girl kidnapped blocks from her front door became the face of the Kidnapped Citizens movement. Her face was on the poster used by the group organized by the families of the disappeared to continue to call attention to the issue decades later. She had been the subject of 4 documentaries, a manga series, a television drama, and an animated film. She has also inspired songs by Peter Frampton and Peter, Paul and Mary's Paul Stuckey. The North Korean government reported to the Japanese government in 2002 that Megumi had married Kim Jong-nam, a South Korean abductee, and had given birth to a daughter, Kim Jong-gyong. They claim Megumi committed suicide in 1994, but offered no evidence. They returned ashes that they claimed were hers to Japan, but DNA testing confirmed that they were not Megumi's remains. Her current status is unknown, and if still alive, she would be 59 years old right now. Kim Jong-gyong grew up, attended Kim Il-sung University in Pyongyang, where she majored in computer science and now has a daughter of her own. In March of 2014, the parents of Yokota Megumi met their granddaughter and great-granddaughter for the first time in Mongolia. Kim Jong-gyong and her daughter then returned to North Korea. Yokota Megumi's case is sadly not unique in any aspect. North Korea returned the remains of Masuki Kaoru, who had been kidnapped while traveling in Europe in May of 1980 as a 21-year-old student. What happened to him in North Korea is not known, but the government claimed that he was killed in an automobile accident in August of 1996. Forensic analysis of the remains, however, confirmed that they were not Kaoru's. Numerous kidnapped Japanese women were forced to marry Korean men, take Korean names, and raise their children to be good North Korean citizens, as Megumi did. In October of 2002, at the request of the Japanese government, 5 abductees were allowed to finally return to Japan after 2 decades in North Korea. The kidnapped couple, Yaushi and Fuki Chimura, kidnapped while on a date in July of 1979, were married in North Korea that same year. They had a daughter and 2 sons who were not allowed to leave with them and remained in North Korea for another 2 years until finally allowed to join their parents in May of 2004. Kaoru and Yukiko Saoki, kidnapped on July 31st of 1978 and married while in North Korea, were another couple repatriated to Japan in October of 2002. Their son and daughter also remained behind, rejoining their parents at the same time as the Chimura children. And lastly, Miyoshi Soga and her 18-year-old daughter Hitomi went out shopping on August 12th of 1978 and never returned home. They were the second couple of Japanese citizens kidnapped by North Korean agents on that day. Ishikawa Shuiki and his date Masumoto Rumiko were abducted while viewing the sunset further down the coast. It's not known what happened to Miyoshi, but Hitomi married an American abductee, Charles Jenkins, and had 2 daughters with him. Hitomi was released as a part of the October 2002 group, with Charles and their daughters following with the group released in 2004. For these families, the abduction nightmare did not end with the return of the abducted people to Japan, as they had to wait 2 years for the children who were kept hostage and left behind. Hundreds of Koreans and Japanese abductees still remain in North Korea with their fates unknown. Now, we focused on the victims from Korea and Japan, but North Korea has kidnapped individuals from all over the world. In the 1970s, many women were abducted from Lebanon, and Dutch, French, Italians, Malaysians, and Jordanians have also been kidnapped by North Korean agents. Allegedly, a missing American citizen, David Snedden, was kidnapped while traveling in China in 2004 by North Korean agents and brought to an invitation-only zone just outside Pyongyang to be the personal English language tutor for Kim Jong-il. How does one repair the loss of one's freedom, identity, and time with one's family? The North Korean abduction project irrevocably changed and damaged thousands of lives, not just of those abducted, but by their families. Any system of government that compels action is evil. The North Koreans acted to kidnap and compel thousands, and nothing screams failure more than forcing individuals to act. Virtue comes from freedom and choice. The North Korean abduction project has done untold harm around the globe and highlights the corruption of communism. Kim Jong-il glibly promised in 2002 to hold those who carried out the program accountable, but I think this would be incredibly challenging as he was the one accountable for the scope of this project, the massive multiple invitation-only zones and the hundreds of minders. The abductions were not a small side project. Now, North Korea has been in the news a great deal for the last decade, from the development of its nuclear program and missile tests to the saber rattling, which occasionally manifests against South Korea and the United States. But it seems, except for a few individuals, the issue of these historic abductees has become forgotten. These kidnappings occurred within a human lifetime, and many of the abductees are most likely still alive and in North Korea today. Even when North Korea says they're dead and offers to return remains, it's suspect whether or not the remains are those who the North Koreans say they are, and has been proven by DNA testing the North Koreans have outright lied about the remains turned over to the West. And perhaps this is the darkest part of this very dark path. There remains so much uncertainty and lack of closure. Hopefully, other abductees will be fortunate enough to leave North Korea alive, like the Lucky 5 brought back to Japan in 2002. But those individuals and stories seem to be few and far between, and this path seems to be closed and forgotten. Thank you for listening to My Dark Path. I'm MF Thomas, the creator and host, and I produce this show with our engineer and creative director, Dom Purdy. This story was prepared for us by Kevin Wetmore. Big thank yous to each of them and the entire My Dark Path team. If you don't mind, please take a moment and give My Dark Path a rating and a review wherever you're at. This is tremendously helpful to the show, and we'd love to hear from you. Again, thanks for walking the dark paths of history, science, and the paranormal with me. And until next time, good night.